Today we are honored to have a lineup of some of our Hoover talent speaking today about the geopolitics that's taking place between the US and India. India is in a really interesting situation, primarily for its geography. It's next to one of America's biggest rivals. It's got its own issues going around with neighboring countries. And of course, it looks straight into Central Asia and the Middle East. So India, as you can imagine, is quite a promising, hopeful place for America, which is looking for a more stable environment. The panel that we've got up here today are esteemed people who've tried to make a more stable world, beginning with Admiral Jim Ellis, who's a Hoover Distinguished Visiting Fellow, the Annenberg Distinguished Visiting Fellow. Jim is one of the nicest, best people around. He's used to commanding huge, literally, navies, right? And he's just a sweet fellow. Can't say enough good things about him. I'm trying to make this a little more personal since it's a dinner time discussion. Šumit is my colleague. He occupies the floor with me up on the second floor of HHMB. He comes to us from the University of Indiana University Bloomington. He is an expert on all things, as we find out with people around here, but especially Kashmir and foreign policy. And then Amit Seru, who's going to be our moderator today. More titles than the King of England with this fellow. And deservedly so, much more than the King of England. He just was born into it. Amit had to earn these titles. Amit is an excellent person who tends to focus on finance and business. For all of you, that sounds excellent. For him, he was a little bit nervous about having a geopolitical panel. But I think, as you will see in a moment, he's more than up to the task of moderating with these two fine gentlemen. So with that, let me give it to Amit. Thank you.
Thank you, Dinsha. All right, so you've heard of Indian spice, and there is no spice in the food, but I'm hoping to inject some spice in our conversation. So welcome, and we are hoping, like Dinsha said, to focus on India's geostrategic position, which, as you know, with the global order shifting as we are seeing around us, perhaps more than and faster than any time since Cold War, to have this conversation. And the way I'm hoping you all will think about this, if you were during the day in the conference, you already heard these bits and pieces, but just to situate it, you can think about three forces hitting India and US relationship. First is the whole structural transformation of Asia, the idea that China is being very assertive. There is also a fragmented regional architecture and a growing competition for influence, not just in the Indian Ocean, but Southeast Asia and Middle East. So that's one piece that you should keep at the back of your mind. The second is what you heard today for the most part, that India has had an amazing journey in the last 3 decades. It's moved from a closed socialist economy to a 4 trillion tech-driven, globally engaged power. Its strategic identity, I think, is long rooted in autonomy and non-alliance, but it's adapted. Let's put it that way. So India cooperates with the US on tech, counter-terrorism, defense modernization, but it still maintains ties with Russia and Middle East and so on. And third, if you think about the India-US relationship, which is the theme of this conference in some sense, there is a persistent disconnect, I would say, at least from my perspectives, for two countries which are democratic in their foundations, with dynamic economies and shared interest in stable Indo-Pacific relationship. There is still a lot of weight of history which drives this relationship. So there is alignments around Cold War which still run true, and maybe that leads to mismatched expectations on both sides. And as China reshapes the map, the stakes of misunderstanding are probably never higher. So today, we are basically going to be doing this and asking where is India strategically situated How does it navigate China, Pakistan, Russia, and the US? And what would a stable long-term partnership of India-US look like? One that's not based on nostalgia and wishful thinking, but on the reality and world as it is. And like Dinsha said, to help us, we have two experts which have very different perspectives on this, so they'll complement each other. And I'll
or contradict.
Or contradict. Yeah. I'm hoping contradict more than agree. And the way we thought we would run this is we will go to both the panelists first, and they'll have some opening remarks on these themes. And then I'll engage them, throw some spice in the conversation, and then we'll go to you. So keep thinking about questions you might have. We don't have a lot of time, but we'll hope to keep it brisk so that we at least get the pointed conversation on the table. So, Admiral, take it away.
Thanks very much, Amit. And thank you all for allowing me to be a part of all of this. I, at first, was wondering why Denise asked me to join it, and then I realized it was actually a tutorial for me, because I learned so much today about the important elements that you all are doing to deal at more of the tactical level, if you will, from a military perspective, and I found it absolutely fascinating. So thank you for that opportunity. We're probably going to elevate it a bit, I think, as an old fighter pilot, maybe up to 20,000 feet or something like that. But my message is fairly simple, and I think keyed it up quite nicely. Some years ago, across the bay in Alameda, there used to be a Navy station, a naval base. And I was once captain of a nuclear aircraft carrier that was stationed there. And its name was Abraham Lincoln. And as a result of being its captain, I decided to do some research on Abraham Lincoln and became quite an admirer of them. And one of the quotes that I often use is one that he gave to the Congress after his second inauguration, where he said, "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate for the stormy present." And I think that's the thematic theme that I'd like to touch on tonight, because I really do believe that that's true. It doesn't mean that we're wrong or that the historical way in which we approach this was incorrect, but, you know, like John Lennon once said, life is what happens to you while you're making other plans. And the world has moved on in real tectonic shifts that I think both the United States and India perhaps need to rethink and account for. So I'll talk hopefully very briefly about what I see as some of the strategic choices facing India, given China's ascendancy. I'll talk about the elephant in the room, as I call it. That's not a Republican analogy for those of you that are, but it's certainly the recent downward trend in U.S.-India relations and how severe that rupture is. And then I'll talk, if there's time, about some defense, diplomatic, and economic architectures that might contribute to our collective security in the Indo-Pacific region. India's strategic choices under China's rise, obviously have capabilities, alignments, and constraints. We define national security here at Hoover, excuse me, very broadly. It includes energy. It includes economics. What you've been talking about today, in its essence, is really national security in a sense, because without a robust and prosperous economy, there is no national security. And Denise has heard me say it in the energy context as well. In this day and age, I think most of us would agree that energy security really is national security in a sense, as the folks in Europe have found, and some of our friends and potential adversaries in the Indo-Pacific region fully appreciate. So we think India confronts a complex combination of a contested land frontier with an enduring potential for kinetic escalation, Chinese power protection and projection into the maritime approaches critical to India's trade and energy security, and then Beijing's growing diplomatic and economic influence across South Asia and the Indian Ocean littoral, what I call the potential for Finlandization of the region, modeled on what the Russians were able to do in Finland for many, many years before and during World War II. And so those are the dynamics that raise the importance of India's maritime modernization, its force posture along the Himalayas, and its external partnerships. And I'll get to that too, because it's the external partnerships I want to focus on. India's got some choices, some strategic options and trade-offs. I'm a small town guy from South Carolina, and my grandfather used to tell me, Jimmy, it's easy to be a clown if you don't have to run the circus. So my purpose here tonight is not to criticize those that are making policy or shaping it or have shaped it in the past, but to point out some observations that may have relevance, and feel free in the Q&A to disagree. But I see India's options as, they can continue to seek a balance by strengthening deterrent capabilities and deepening appropriate partnerships. I think that's a viable option, probably the most likely. They can hedge. And there's some question if that hedging is already underway, by selectively engaging Beijing economically while limiting security cooperation. And then there's a final option, which would be, I would call strategic accommodation, which would involve concessions in either influence or territory. That's not politically attractive and is too operationally risky, and I don't see India pursuing that. The downward trend, it's, Sumi and I were talking yesterday, it's in the eyes of some, not all, this is as bad as it's been for decades, since after the nuclear tests and the like. I'm not in a position to judge that. I talk to some people who are in India. I get different stories. Some say, no, it's ephemeral, it'll pass, things are going to go back to normal. Others say, nope, it's irrevocably lost. I always say there's three sides to every story. There's yours, there's mine, and there's the truth. And so we need to figure out where the truth is in all of that conversation. And I think that's an important place. There is no doubt that the punitive tariffs and the advanced legislative measures that are under consideration to adversely affect the technology service industries and the like have huge implications for India economically. And part of it's complicated by the fact that I was interested in the ambassador in his address to us to start the conference, talked about the ecosystem. I didn't used to like that term. I'm growing to appreciate the term ecosystem. But I think what we're living in today, unfortunately, is an ecosystem in which a lot of the leaders are so personally wrapped up in these issues that there's a real risk of that being the primary influence or reactive mechanism that shapes national policy decisions and the like. And it's a human trait. I'm not being critical of any specific individual. Wasn't it Maslow that said esteem, I think, was number 4 in his hierarchy of needs. So we all need that esteem, but I'm wondering if it hasn't risen to a level of prominence between Putin and Modi and Trump that now makes us kind of in an interesting situation where it is a part of the consideration. Is it the overarching one? I hope not. I hope cooler heads will prevail, and we can talk about that. How serious is the fracture? Well, it's tactical in a military sense. I mean, the tariffs, the bills, there's a little bit of structural dislocation in that we're losing some trust and confidence in America and its reliability as a partner. But there are other things. I don't think the strategic alignment has shifted, not yet. I mean, I think it's too fresh, it's too new. People do understand the importance of the relationship. So, in a sense, the challenge facing India is that old aphorism we all remember, where you can't control all the time what happens to you, but you can control how you react to it. And I think that's the essential question that needs to be considered right now as we look to the options that are confronting India. It's okay to focus on the tactical, to do stuff, but as Sumi has heard me say too many times, there's an old military saying that tactical energy in a strategic vacuum is a recipe for disaster. In other words, if you don't have an idea of what you want to accomplish, doing stuff, the tactical level stuff, can be counterintuitive or counterproductive or actually damaging to your progress going forward. So what are the things that are complicating this? We've got some divergent strategic cultures. India has historically prioritized its strategic autonomy, its non-alignment, its sovereign right to independent policymaking, all of which is completely understandable. But the newer U.S. expectations of alignment and geopolitical crises is a complicating factor that we perhaps didn't have fast. I mean, now Washington can review or view New Delhi's restraint as equivocation, if not, in their words, moral cowardice. And, Jim Mattis and I wrote a piece some years ago where we said, we're accustomed to thinking of things, if they're not with us, they're against us. What the United States needs to understand is if they're not against us, they're really with us in a very real sense. And that's an important flipping of the context for the conversation going forward. So, The question that India has to answer is, and only India can answer this, is its historic playbook, the one that it used for years, and that ambivalence, that neutrality, that, that free electron approach, as I call it, for those physicists like Steve in the room that can flit from one atom to the other, depending on the circumstances. Is that game plan still adequate if we're playing a new game? And has it moved on, or will it go back to being the game it always was? I'm a believer that the game has changed, and that a reassessment of that and the fine-tuning of that might be in India's interest, because it's not just the degree of difficulty now, it's the speed with which things are changing. And that's the complicating factor. I mean, change is not hard if it's slow. I mean, I used to have hair, for example. But now it's the speed of change, the pace at which it's going that complicates things. Every day there's something new. It's the information flow. It's the changing, the whipsawing of policies and decisions on the part of the United States that can inject a lot of uncertainty there. And so, how do we think about reversing this? I think it's going to be that's going to be hugely important. People talk about how you might do this. First off, I think this is not going to go away anytime soon. We were talking before during the cocktail hour about, we're only 10 months into this administration, for crying out loud. We've got 3 more years left, and look at what's happened in those 10 months. So the idea that this is going to pass and get back to normal, I don't think so. From a physics standpoint or a metallurgical standpoint, it's kind of like that bending metal. It never quite goes back to what it once was. So the question is, how dramatic is that change? I think we need to focus on this, and I would recommend that India think about it in these terms as a permanent, minister-level bilateral mechanism for crisis prevention and dispute resolution. And others, you can't have an ad hoc group that you get together every time you get a bad tweet or X or whatever it's called these days. I mean, this is going to be a part of the conversation. I don't know how India is organized. It's not my remit to give you that, but I think that needs to be part of the consideration. We've got to negotiate an economic de-escalation and a rules-based trade map going forward. And I talk about negotiate because, sometimes people talk about bargaining. Bargaining is unilateral. Bargaining is what's unfortunately happening now when America says this is what we want and we're now only arguing about the price. A negotiation is a win-win. The objective is to have both sides benefit from this, and that understanding, I think, at least temporarily, seems to be a bit absent, and that's America's fault, not India's fault. But I think we need to differentiate between bargaining, which is what we're really doing, and negotiations, which we want to get back to. I think there's an opportunity in defense industrial cooperation with the appropriate levels of reciprocity. We've nibbled at this for a while. I was on the board of Lockheed for 20 years. We manufacture C-130 fuselages there, Sikorsky helicopters there, but the jet engine piece has just come to India in the last couple of years. How do we get beyond that, satisfy the ITAR needs, and create a sense of collaboration and ultimately perhaps dependency in some positive ways that can serve us going forward? We've got to respectfully manage India's desire for autonomy, and we've got to acknowledge India's right to that, avoid coercive ultimatums on transactions, be it energy or legacy defense ties, all the things we know so well. And I think Washington then can calibrate its expectations, because we need a little bit more transparency from India on what it means by this when the Prime Minister goes to China, for example. The good news is he didn't stay for the parade. That was an intentional signal. So, but a little bit more transparency on that can avoid the misperceptions that can arise if all you do is see something on the news and you get some snide comment in response from the White House. We think there are multilateral opportunities for India and using multilateral platforms. I believe personally this is a leadership opportunity for India, because China talks about it doesn't want to be a global hegemon, but I guarantee you it wants to be a regional hegemon. And so if it isn't going to be China, who is it going to be? And I think that's an opportunity for India, should it choose, to think about it in those terms and fill that vacuum that will be created if and when the U.S. decides to pull back from that. And finally, we've got to continue the people-to-people, the educational and subnational ties like this conference that are so important. If we're not talking up here, we need to be talking down here so we can preserve the relationships and the understandings and the appreciation of what we're looking for. So in conclusion, I think the downward trend in U.S.-India relations is neither trivial nor irreversible. Economically punitive measures and protectionist legislative proposals have introduced a pronounced shock to the trust and have tangible near-term costs for India, there is no doubt. But the deeper strategic logic, shared interest in maritime security, counterterrorism, economic complementarities between the two countries offers a pathway back if we can get to the point, as I said, of negotiation rather than bargaining. And I think India can and should lead in the face of this strategic ambiguity that they're getting. And believe me when I say it only means that India consider changing its policy, not its principles. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. The utterly fascinating thing is that I cannot find a single item to disagree with. We are in vehement agreement. There is literally no daylight between us. And you've literally made my evening by invoking the term Finlandization, because I used it in an article and I was excoriated for suggesting that the PRC has actually Finlandized India, that certain options are simply off the table, which is exactly what the Soviets tried to do to Finland during much of the Cold War. It's interesting that Jim focused mostly on the present, because I had actually was going to talk about the past. And so this will be quite complementary. There are 6 points I will make in this presentation. First, during the Cold War, the relationship was non-existent. The US and India really had very little in common. India's strategy of import substituting industrialization, its autarkic economic policies, the lack of people-to-people contacts prior to 1965, when the omnibus civil rights, not civil rights, but the Immigration Reform Act was passed, and also there was no strategic relationship worth the name. All that started to change in the last years of the Clinton administration. And then a bipartisan consensus developed about the importance of India. And of course, it received the most extraordinary boost in the wake of the US-India nuclear accord under the George W. Bush administration. Something that I continue to tell my Indian interlocutors is that you have no idea of the amount of political capital that the president expended, both at home and abroad, to make an exception for India. That was a remarkable achievement, and it needs to be repeatedly underscored. My third point is that a range of administrations, regardless of their ideological orientation, have sustained this relationship, including during the first Trump administration. It's only in the second incarnation that there has been this fracture in Indo-US relations, but I still remain hopeful that it will not lead to a permanent rift. The fourth point is, sadly, I would argue that owing to unforced errors on both sides, the relationship is definitely in the doldrums. However, it would be a mistake to argue that it is going to inevitably plummet. And I'll tell you why, for both historical and contemporary reasons. It's a little-known fact that during the 1971 East Pakistan crisis, the US, of course, sent in the USS Enterprise into the Bay of Bengal and under the aegis of the US 7th Fleet. That's well known. What's not known, and I obtained this through a Freedom of Information Act request, is that the orders to the 7th Fleet were the following. if any Indian naval vessel tries to intercept you, sink them. Hardly anybody knows this, but this is a fact. And this was the extent to which the relationship had plunged. And the memories of 71 continue to animate a generation still that's alive in India and who lived through that episode. So we are not in a 1971 moment. That's to put it in historical perspective. Second, the relationship has considerable ballast today. Look at the number of Indian CEOs in this country, and particularly in the high-tech sector. It's going to be extremely difficult to unravel this relationship, the troubles with the H-1B visa issue notwithstanding. Second, look at the range of people-to-people contacts. Look at the scope and the dimensions of American investment in India. Admiral Ellis has already alluded to certain components of the defense industry, which are now located in India. This was unthinkable 30 years ago. It was unimaginable. That's completely changed. In addition to that, there is a viable economic relationship, the tariff war notwithstanding. All of this cannot be unraveled in a matter of months. And one should not act on the basis of a peak. Fifth, I would argue, that was my fifth point, that the relationship has substantial ballast, economic, strategic, and diplomatic. Sixth and finally, it's easy to become despondent and to be trapped, and to use a phrase that a noted American political scientist, David Apter, coined, to become a prisoner of the moment. We should not become prisoners of the moment. Yes, this is a trying time. It's a vexing time. There are sentiments that are frayed on both sides, but the relationship has substance, unlike in the Cold War. Consequently, just as Mark Twain once wrote that the reports of his death had been greatly exaggerated, I think it would be much too cavalier to suggest that this relationship now is completely on the skids and that it's irretrievable. It most assuredly is not. And just to follow up on a couple of themes that Jim highlighted, there is a couple of issues that I think really trouble India's policymakers, despite the significant improvement that has taken place in the relationship over the past 30 years. And this is even before the Trump tariffs and the rift or the fracture that has taken place. And here I'm going to put on my international relations hat. These are what international relations scholars call either the fear of abandonment, that the US will not stand by India at its time of need, and that India will be left to its own devices, or entrapment, that India will become so close to the United States that it will limit its strategic autonomy. Both these fears, I argue, are completely unfounded. Again, since I'm a historically oriented political scientist, while people remember the tragedy of 1971, what most Indian policymakers forget is that the US provided vital supplies to India in October 1962. when the PLA was swooping down the Himalayas and had seized significant portions of Indian territory. I had the privilege of interviewing Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, who was the ambassador to India just before the onset of the war. And there was an acerbic Indian defense minister called Krishna Menon, who always was prodding and piquing the United States. Bunker told me that at one night, he's woken up by a phone call from Krishna Menon at about 2 a.m. in the morning. And Menon says, "Ellsworth, I need C-17s. So why are you calling me up at 2 o'clock in the morning? Well, it occurred to me we desperately need C-17s to be able to quickly transport our troops up to the border, and I don't possess it." I said, "Well, couldn't this wait till the morning?" "No, it occurred to me at this hour of night, so I thought I'd call you." And Bunker said, well, I arranged for him to get the C-17s. Not only that, it's little known that the US collaborated with India to have overflights of the Himalayas of American reconnaissance aircraft with Indian Air Force markings all the way until 1970, when Henry Kissinger, because of the opening to China, ended that relationship. So it's not as if the US has, despite Cold War tensions, abandoned India. Far from it. There were elements of strategic convergence which have come roaring back today, especially because of what Jim highlighted. The increasing assertiveness of the PRC, and to use an old English expression, the periodic sweet words from Xi Jinping, "butter no parsnips." This is an enduring rivalry, and anyone in New Delhi who believes that this rivalry will simply can be ameliorated by one more summit with Xi Jinping is obviously smoking a weed I was familiar with in college, and unlike a certain American president, I did inhale. So this notion that somehow a miraculous rapprochement can be achieved with the PRC is simply a fool's errand. And India essentially, again, to wear my international relations hat, has two choices. One is called self-help, where you build up your own capabilities to deal with an implacable adversary. I think that's admirable, except it's not about to happen anytime soon. The asymmetries of capabilities between the PRC and India are so great that in the foreseeable future, the strategy of self-help is not a viable one. So what can you do? You resort to what is called external balancing. And yes, the Quad is fine. A relationship with Japan is fine. A relationship with Australia is desirable. But despite the current difficulties, the only country that can ensure that India's chestnuts can be taken out of the fire remains the United States. If you believe otherwise, you are living in a world of your own making, as Prime Minister Nehru said in the wake of the '62 war. He said, we are victims of our own illusions. We were living in a world of our own making.
All right. Okay, let me ask a couple of questions, and then please keep your questions ready so that you can get to food. So our incentives are aligned, I guess. Admiral, you mentioned a few things, so I just want to put you in the spot to give an answer. Good. And I don't think you will shy away from it. You talked about how US and India are talking about co-producing jet engines, drones, and so on. Is this partnership real or just political signaling?
Well, I think it's a little bit of both. The reality is that India has a great technological capability, and that's well known and well documented. And so the issue always comes back to intellectual property and ITAR and restrictions, and when things start to get classified, in today's world, basically. Every fighter jet basically is software with wings, and so the idea of how that works, and particularly as artificial intelligence becomes a part of it, being able to safeguard those things, that's an issue with treaty allies that we have, and we've done conferences here at Hoover on documenting how difficult that has been as we move in AUKUS, for example, into Pillar 2, which is technology focused and has had its fits and starts as a result of difficulty. So I'm not trying to make it easy. In fact, Ronald Reagan famously once said, there are simple answers, there are just no easy answers. The two are not the same. And so it's easy for me to say we need to do more of this because to capitalize on that, but it's going to require some give on both sides. We're going to have more trust that this will be safeguarded, that it won't be proliferated or shared inappropriately. India will likely be expected to make some long-term commitments. I mean, years ago, India was offered the opportunity Lockheed was willing to move the F-16 production line to India, but India chose not to accept that, and so again, it's got to be a negotiation, not a bargaining, and I think it's worth the exploration. And I think if we're going to have a long-term relationship of real value, that's what it's going to have to come down to. Back to what Sumi said, And again, this is a question that only India can answer. But if India's future, as you see it, as all Indians see it, in the distant future, involves a relationship with America, a positive and strong relationship with America, then why are we pretending that we're going to walk away from this and that we're going to we have other alternatives and the like? And I think our focus should be on how do we realize that? It's what I call the foggy path syndrome. Okay, you may not be able to see clearly to the destination, but you can see 100 meters down the path. So you start walking, and then you can see another 100 meters, and then this takes you in a direction that ultimately gets you to your goal. So I'm not implying it's easy and it can be done with a signed agreement or a hand wave, but I do think it's that important that we establish that kind of a quality relationship that has legs Can
I follow up?
Sure.
And Sumit, please feel free to jump in because you'll see this is connected to many of the things that you've talked about. How do you assess India's military modernization, especially when we think about the joint China-Pak dynamic that is happening in the region? And Sumit, you should also comment on this because this dynamic is relatively new. Probably you've been talking about it, but
it's not fast enough, in my view. Again, it gets back to that topic of speed I talked about. I mean, these things are changing dramatically. It's not a secret, and it's certainly not classified that Pakistan brought long-range air-to-air missiles to the fight, and it reminds me of the Civil War story attributed to a Confederate general that was raised not far from where I grew up, who told his constituents before the Civil War that we can beat those Yankees with corn stalks. Well, they lost the war. He emigrated to England to hide after the war. He finally came back sheepishly, and one of his neighbors asked him, "I thought you told us we could beat them with corn stalks." He said, "We could have, but they wouldn't fight with corn stalks." And so my point here is that you've got to deal with the technology piece, and the world is changing, and if there's going to be relevance and there's going to be a part of, and I'm not implying that the Quad needs to be turned into a military alliance. I'm not saying we need to mirror image NATO in the Indo-Pacific. I'm not saying any of that thing, but there's got to be a security element to this that involves interoperability, and we're challenged in that regard. We, the U.S., are. I mean, we can't provide to Taiwan today what we provide to the Ukraine every day. Mm-hmm. because we don't have the ability to plug into their communication systems, to deconflict targets. If we're going to come to somebody's assistance or fight together, we want to make sure we know who the good guys and the bad guys are, the identification friend or foe capabilities, the blue force tracking, the kinds of things. And if you develop that capability, it becomes a deterrent character all its own. And your potential adversaries see that. And so it doesn't necessarily compromise your independence, your independent policy judgments and those kind of things. It's just there in reserve if and when you need it, because there's not going to be time to create it on the fly given today's technologies.
Thank you. Sumit?
Unfortunately, Indian military modernization is at best a patchwork quilt. There are some elements that are underway which are working, but basically the defense industrial base needs to be fundamentally revamped. The Defense Research and Development Organization has, for the most part, failed to develop technologies which are commensurate with the challenges that India faces. The discrepancy between the PRC and India is growing by the hour, not by the day. And it's interesting that Jim brought up the F-16 production line, because if I may be so self-referential, the current Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, Paul Kapoor, and I wrote an article in Foreign Affairs called F-16s Made in India, where we made a spirited argument why India should accept this. Unfortunately, the policymakers said, no, the Pakistanis have F-16s, and so we shouldn't purchase the F-16 production line. It was one of the most colossal strategic errors. India has been trying to develop a light combat aircraft. It's often referred to somewhat sardonically as the late-coming aircraft. It was started in 1984, the project. Even today, India just last week announced, and actually I'm delighted at one level, it's going to buy 113 GE404 engines to power the aircraft. The Kaveri engine that was developed by India could not generate enough thrust for the plane to take off. The avionics of the plane are from France. The radar is from Israel. That's delightful. I suspect what's indigenous about the plane is the paint. If this is what the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited is producing today, we need a fundamental revamp of the defense establishment. And it's not going to happen overnight. But given that it's not going to happen overnight, you turn to a partner who can actually be of assistance while you try to get your house in order. And the tragedy is, HAL was not always like this. There was a time when Hindustan Aeronautics Limited manufactured, under license from Britain, a supersonic aircraft called HF-24, and also manufactured a subsonic aircraft called the Gnat. Both of them saw service in the 1965 war and the 71 war. But since then, despite the expenditure of crores of rupees, HAL is basically a white elephant.
Yeah, to build on Sumit's point, and we don't have time to dwell on it tonight, and it's not the subject of the conference, but the character of warfare has changed. Absolutely. I mean, and so this is not a criticism just of India. It's a criticism of the United States, too, as we look at our own reform proposals for the defense industrial base, as we call it. We're not nearly fast enough. We're not nearly cheap enough. We're not nearly numerically at the levels that we're going to have. I mean, we're proudly talking about, the most sophisticated surface-to-air missile, one of them in the U.S. inventory, we produce at the rate of 1 per month. Yeah. 1 per month, you know. There's going to be thousands of those fired on the first day of a conflict. And we talk about drones and the like, and then the potential, and we see that playing out in Ukraine. We don't. I mean, people say, well, I can build you a drone for $100,000. Ukraine is expending 8,000 of these things a day. You know, we're not nearly cheap enough. We're not nearly at the right price point. And how we think about that and then bring it together with legacy systems, how do you command and control it all? I mean, we're all facing these kinds of challenges. Wouldn't it be nice to begin to think about this collectively rather than individually, and share those experiences all along and build that cohesiveness together as we create this architecture? And I just think that there's huge opportunities, given India's technical capabilities, its workforce availability, and the like, if we can find the right collaborative mechanism.
So on that great note, let's open it up for questions. Please raise your hand. Yep, please go ahead. I think they might bring the mic so that...
Ravi Thapar, I've been in the Foreign Service for 36 years, and I'm currently the Senior Director for the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Compliments, it's a brilliant analysis, historical, contemporary, and defense and security. Just want to snatch a few moments, because this is not my panel, but based on my sustained exposure to geopolitical international affairs, I just want to say in a summarized way, all that India is asking for is a bit of diplomatic, political, and economic space. India is a very ambitious, aspirational, capable, emerging economy. It has certain domestic compulsions. We also appreciate that your government at this point has some domestic political compulsions. I think that is all that is, complicating the issues. When I examine Prime Minister Modi's, or review Prime Minister Modi's visit, I think in June 23, and the amount of defense and strategic agreement and resonance which was there in the country, and the exceptions which were made, giving technology, etc. to India, I see that as a conscious assessment. It was not a whimsical political shout. It was a conscious assessment by the US intellectuals, think tanks, defense establishment, and it was an acceptance of that by the Indian government. I also don't see, I find it naive to suggest that India will walk the China way. As long as China is going to be inward-looking and not a democracy, I don't think we will risk that. By the same token, I also don't see the US allowing that to happen, because the only country in Asia at this point which can possibly contain and check the Chinese influence is India. It's 1/5 of the world's humanity. It's an ambitious power. It is participating in a lot of multilateral conversations. It is committed to a structured, multilateral, engaging world order. Is that not in favor? Does that not support the US corporate sector? Does that not support a better planet? I think we, some of the global South leaders, US, Europe, have to be the pillars and the foundations of the new world order. Otherwise, you're going to have AI and, God forbid, quantum computing, which is going to go far beyond the 120 or 150 bits encryption. If this gets into rogue entities and closed inward systems, I think it's very dangerous. So I don't want to continue on this because I've been in this profession for a while, but I just want to assure that there is a lot of well-thought, analyzed, basis and foundation to this relationship. There's a lot of economics, there's a lot of market, there's a lot of contributing together the talent and the engineer, so many things which can be done together. So I would just like to, put my vote for this relationship, and I don't believe that this political squall or storm is going to really dilute the long-term potential which exists. Thank you so much.
Thanks. I'll collect a few questions, and then I'll give you the last word to close the panel, because I'm guessing we'll be kicked out without food, which would be food for thought, but not appreciated by our guests. Please. So I'll collect 2 or 3.
This is a question for both the panelists, but I start from Professor Ganguly's remark. You said U.S. planes flew with the IAF between 1962 and 70, and then it stopped because of the Kissinger rapprochement with China.
Yeah.
And so why can't that be happening now again? You said summit theory will not necessarily mean a shift in relationship, but President tweeted about G2. So is that one of the possibilities that we trying to sort of gloss over or overlook because we don't like that prospect? So are we confusing our preferences for predictions? So I would like to hear the views of both the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thanks. Let's go to this table.
Yeah, I'll keep sitting if I may. So it's hard to be cynical after a wonderful seminar organized by Šumit. Congratulations. So my question is fairly simple. I mean, to be cynical, almost every country acts in a self-interest. Absolutely. Hard to believe that is not true. And when the United States blew hot on India, it was in their self-interest because they had other conflicting interests. And for the last 20, 30 years, I think, as Šumit pointed out, it's been positive to India, but again, in the self-interest of the United States. So my question to you is, because I need to opine on this in Delhi soon, is how come the United States has changed its attitude to India? So it's also in the self-interest of the US. So what is the source of the self-interest which causes the switch?
Thank you. Thanks for a really stimulating pair of remarks. Both speakers made a really convincing case, and interestingly, I think perhaps even more passionately, Professor Ganguly, for the preservation and sort of backing the Indo-US relationship. And I'm largely convinced, but it seems to me that it's worth at least sort of interrogating the alternatives. And the alternative is, of course, what was India's growing potential relationship with the PRC. And I think that the kind of idea that there'll be a sort of a strong alignment, both of you all dismissed, and I think it's fair to dismiss it. But what about something that ends up being sort of a non-alignment 3.0 kind of story for India, right? Where there's a bit of hedging that goes on. And you can see the logic in that. From the Chinese point of view, well, let me back up a second. Most of the arguments for the India and US story here, and so as I said, I'm playing devil's advocate here a little bit, but most of the arguments for the India-US story are about the structural interests. But what we've seen in the last few months is that the structural interests aren't actually dominating the conversation, and the US political system is throwing up a set of idiosyncratic reactions. And in that context, what should India do? Hedging seems to be perhaps something to be thought about, right? So what does China need most? It needs a market to rival the US. The only country capable of providing that market is India. What does India need? India needs access to technology. It needs the ability to sort of learn how to do rapid manufacturing, perhaps the kind of joint venture story. We heard from Dr. Nageswaran that there's skepticism in China about opening the door to India, which means it probably won't be of the scale that India desires, but it doesn't mean it has to be completely closed. Could one imagine a sort of muddling through story? From both countries, I don't have any delusions, despite my professional center of gravity, that climate change is going to drive this decision. But could it be a thumb on the scale? Because at the end of the day, for India's energy needs, if we are going to go to a fossil world, if Africa is going to go to a fossil world, you don't have to be a climate existentialist to know that the problem is going to get much, much worse, right? What's the only country capable of providing that clean energy technology right now? It's really China. The US we have conversations increasingly about China as the emerging electrostate and the US as the emerging petrostate. If I was an Indian policymaker, I'd be very wary of doubling down on a petrostate story for the developing world. Right? So are there ingredients there that allow China and India to hedge a little bit? Can we end up in that kind of non-alignment 3.0 sort of world? I think it's worth engaging and perhaps dismissing those remarks before we completely embrace the inevitability of the Indo-US rapprochement.
Thank you both so much. Incredibly compelling. I'm Ronak Desai, one of the visiting fellows here at Hoover. So I guess two quick things. One is there seems to be a conspicuous paucity of good historical metaphor for what's happening in the relationship now, right? And folks are invoking, Admiral, you talked about post-nuclear testing in May of '98 and the imposition of sanctions. I've heard folks talk about Devyani Khobragadi. We're going all the way back to the Cold War. This moment, although, seems different. And part of that is because, we've heard one of the governing platitudes of the relationship is that it's very vulnerable to irrational exuberance and irrational despair. Are we in a despair pull right now? At the same time, we've also heard, Šumit, you rightfully pointed out, bipartisan for the last 25 years, or nonpartisan, right? It's a relationship that transcends personality, party, irrespective of who's the prime minister or president. China was one of the foundational pillars of countering the rise of China. That's, again, spanned all these administrations. A lot of that seems to be in question, right? There are those that are now asking, does President Trump perhaps see China, yes, as an economic competitor, but not as a geostrategic rival, based upon the way things are unfolding now? Does that fundamentally, A, put into question the underlying strategic logic going forward, which is why what we're seeing in the past isn't going to work? And two, in terms of concrete proposals moving forward, given perhaps the unique moment that's governing the bilateral, what would you guys propose?
So here is what we'll do. Each of you has 2 minutes. So you pick and choose whatever you want to pick and choose, and the rest we address over dinner.
Okay. Let me take a stab and try and combine several of the questions. I think this talk of a G2 is implausible. I think it's loose talk. There are structural differences between the United States and China which cannot be overcome by personalities and the idiosyncrasies of a particular presidency. In the international relations tradition, I'm an unabashed realist, and consequently, the distribution of power in the global system is much more important than the role of personalities. Personalities can override a moment or can be important in a particular moment, but the structural features of the international system are such it is hard to visualize a G2 arrangement between the United States and the PRC. We don't have enough time. That would be the subject of another conference, and maybe we'll do it yet. But the prospect of a G2, which Zbigniew Brzezinski actually proposed originally, I think is a chimera. Hedging. Yes, of course, to some degree, hedging is understandable. On the other hand, to quote Lenin, except in this case to reverse it, Lenin once said that the capitalists will sell us the rope to hang them. Turning to China for helping India's energy needs is essentially buying into Lenin's proposition. They will sell India the rope to hang India with. I can again elaborate on this perhaps on the sidelines after dinner. Yes, for the moment, Trump's motto seems to be drill, baby, drill, but there are structural incentives that are going to lead the United States away from its dependence on fossil fuels and particularly gasoline. Some may disagree, but I think that's the wave of the future. And it is very important not to give into this kind of irrational despair. And Ronak, obviously something I said somehow eluded you, because I referred to 1971 when the orders of the US 7th Fleet were to sink any Indian naval vessel that stood in its way. We are nowhere near there today. This is not the Caribbean. That's not going to happen. So consequently, it's important, again, to quote David Apter, not to be a prisoner of the moment.
Thank you, Šumit.
Yeah. I think what we're seeing is the rise in my wife's parlance. She's the professor of engineering over here. She talks about uncertainty a lot, and I think that's what's characterizing not just our relationships between India and the United States, but globally. I mean, there's uncertainty about what's going to happen tomorrow. There's uncertainty if policies are going to be whipsawed. And it's not all the blame of technology. I mean, some of it's human intervention and policies, but I think we're going to have to come to grips with the fact that we're not going to know for certain. And I think hedging is going to have to be a part of how we think about these things. But it doesn't have to be pro or con. It's not, okay, if I can't trust you fully, I'm going to go somewhere else. I hedge against that relationship, within the preserving the relationship, but perhaps adjusting its severity, its integrity, and its dimensions. What's changed? Self-interest has always been a part, but it gets back to what I talked about earlier. We've gone from a transactional conversation to a bargaining conversation in the United States in a very real sense. And so the question now is, there's been a perception created that America has been disadvantaged and taken advantage of. It's ironic because we always have decried the victim mentality in others, and now we're using it ourselves publicly as a reason to shape policies and the like. And the question that's being asked is, in India's case is, hey, we've been helping India out for all these years. All they do is ask for things. What do we get in return? Now, that's not fair. You know the answers to that, but a lot of folks in Washington don't seem to be comfortable that there are answers to that. And I think that's going to have to be a part of what's going forward. So we've got to get back to something that as I was saying, it's got to be a negotiation rather than a transaction. The non-aligned 3.0, I don't see it happening. I mean, it's going to be a different world. And, we talk about deglobalizing. We're not deglobalizing. We're trying to reglobalize without China. That's what it is. And so the fact of the matter is that we're going to need each other, and those relationships are going to be important. So, a standalone, non-aligned, less economically advantaged, that's not India anymore. And I would argue that in a lot of cases of the non-aligned, it's not them anymore either. As one of the benefits of what we have collectively been able to do since the Second World War is we've elevated, in a real sense, more and more countries to the, quote, middle class, if you will, and their expectations are real. They want to be a part of this. They don't just want to be a benefit. They don't want to take your largesse and your charity. They want to contribute, and they want to earn, and they want to be a participating member. So I don't see a separate non-aligned movement in the way that we saw it during the Cold War. Climate, I think you're exactly right. I think it's going to be a reality, but this is a technology issue. Okay, the transition that is underway, slowed perhaps, unarguably slowed, it's being challenged by technology, and it's being challenged by costs unfairly borne by those that can least afford it. I gave a talk at Dallas, so apologies, Steve, you're going to hear it again, but when I got into the energy sector after leaving the Navy, it was the nuclear sector, and I was told by a nuclear CEO, Jim, you need to understand one thing. Nuclear is a business, it's not a religion. And if we can't subsidize our way out of this climate situation, we've got to find a way to make this an ecosystem in the positive sense of the word, using eco, where people can make a decent living, a decent profit, and still have the outcomes and benefits that we all know ultimately are going to be necessary to preserve the environment going forward. We're not there yet. We want to be. We've got lots of models that say we should have been there yesterday. India's remarkable changes in terms of the emissions-free generation, and quite frankly, China's as well, who leads the world in that effort, as you know. All those things are models, but you've got to have grid-scale storage. You've got to have reliability of supply. You've got to have grids that are restructured and remanaged to balance the VARs so you preserve grid stability. I mean, there's lots of things out there. This is not a hand wave, and it's not an intentional delay. It's just kind of okay, how do we make sure that we lay the foundation for that going forward appropriately? And I think we need to. Finally, I'll end with a quote from Stephen Kotkin, because he's not here, and it's one of my favorite quotes from Stephen. It's, those that don't study history think everything is unprecedented. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Admiral Ellis and Professor Ganguly, for an exceptional conversation. I hope everybody found this illuminating, both in terms of opportunities and challenges, both for India and for the India-US relationship going forward. So let's enjoy dinner. Thank you both for
our pleasure.
your time.